everyone. I thought we'd start out by briefly reviewing or asking for any questions that might have occurred to you on the material concerning modalities that we were recently discussing. So just to set the stage, we went through three different uses of logical modalities. Remember, the logical modalities were things like possibility, necessity, impossibility, contingency, and there were three ways in which you could employ these or attribute them. You could attribute them to propositions, which many believe is the primary or most basic use of modality is in reference to propositions. This is known as modality de dicto, or modality as applied to a dictum or statement or proposition. Like it's necessarily the case that 2 and 2 is 4, or it's impossible that spherical cubes exist. So it would be applied to the proposition that 2 and 2 is 4, or the proposition that spherical cubes exist. So there it's a propositional or de dicto attribution of a modality, whether it's necessity or possibility or what have you. Then there was the attribution to objects, like a necessary being.
Like Descartes' God.
God necessarily exists, or an electron contingently exists. The president contingently exists. Spherical cubes have impossible existence. Though you could say that's a strange or questionable use, since if spherical cubes are impossible, what object are we saying is impossible, right? So unless you believe in impossible objects like Meinong, it's hard to see how you could really ascribe impossibility to an object.
Well,
So you might just say the proposition that there's a spherical cube is impossible. If it's not clear, you can really ascribe it to an individual. Possible beings, though, include contingent beings and any necessary beings. So unicorns might be an example of possible beings that are not actual. Such beings are called merely possible as opposed to actual beings. All actual beings are possible, including necessary beings like God, if he exists or she exists. On the other hand, contingent beings are also possible. Those would be actual beings that might fail to exist in some possible circumstance. Okay. And finally, you might have some merely possible contingent beings that don't actually exist but could have.
in the past, or?
No, like ever.
Okay.
But they could have existed, like maybe a possible child that I could have with somebody that I never did, right? So if you take a sperm and an egg, if the sperm were to fertilize an egg, that would create a human being. But that may never happen. So you could talk about the possible human being that would have resulted from that fertilization. Does that make sense? It seems like that could be a determinate being, like a specific being. Another example is maybe even more concrete and tangible would be a piece of matter, okay, which never in fact exists, but would be composed of, say, this piece of wood. We'll say this piece of steel, and this piece of steel over here. You could, so to speak, create a pedestal by bringing them together. If the surfaces are smooth enough, you wouldn't need any glue. You could just slide them together and they would stick. Really super smooth surfaces. They would form a bond without glue or anything. It would merge into a solid piece of steel. But they're never attached. That never happens. But if they did, you'd have that specific individual. So that would be a merely possible individual, the one that I'm referring to when I talk about the object you get here by putting these two together. In the way you could call it a table, right, or a pedestal. That would be like the leg or the pillar, and that would be the top. It would be originally composed of this pedestal P plus this tabletop T. So we're talking about the object, which is the unification of T on top of P in a certain position. Never exists because the two objects, as it happens, never are joined. But if they were, it seems like you can focus your mind on a specific, particular, merely possible entity. Okay, so that's what I argue. What do you think? Does that make sense? Or
You said, and I have it in my notes, that possible objects are contingent and necessary beings. Is that
Yeah.
correct? Okay.
so that would be which one? That would be a contingent.
The
be-
T and the P?
Yeah, the TP thing, yeah. No, the T is actual and the P is actual, but the PT object is unreal.
So now we're introduced another word, actual, which is we empirically know them to be real? Or?
Yeah, something like that. They exist, actually. It's just really a synonym for exists. Maybe emphasizing their existence. Unless you introduce a notion of possible worlds, which we talk about shortly.
Okay.
Then you could distinguish different worlds, the actual world and as well as other possible worlds.
And when we use the word being, is it interchangeable with actual, or is it interchangeable with just a thing?
Yeah, an existent, an entity. Yeah, being is an entity as opposed to a non-entity,
And then a
like the
non-entity-
spherical cube.
Okay, so a non-entity would be something that's an impossible object, or an object that's an...
It's just unreal,
Okay.
doesn't exist, might be impossible. Yeah, unicorns, but also, right? Non-entities. All right, so it's interesting that you can have possible, merely possible objects like that it still seems can be individuated. So it's one thing to talk about like a herd of unicorns, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We really can't distinguish any of these possible objects in the herd from other ones, right? Being that they're all imaginary or merely possible. But in this case, we actually can, right? We can distinguish a particular possible table as distinguished from other possible ones. Like the one made out of this blackboard eraser and this book. So it would be a different possible object, right? This one. We still don't have the object because it's not attached. So it's got a stick to like make a decent table, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just nothing.
Plotting.
Yeah, so you don't have anything until you until they fuse or are bonded somehow, right? Like nails or paste or whatever. But if you bring in nails and paste, then you've got three objects. You can put right? Well, which you can have, right? I mean, you can talk about the combination of the paste, and it's just three. But actually, if you have really good blocks, steel gauge blocks, you just have to put them on each other and rotate them. They're solid.
I have a question from last class. Is there a boundary between an object's surface and its interior? So you were talking a lot about this.
The surface is already a boundary.
No, but like how you have the inside of the sphere,
Yeah.
and then you have the surface itself.
Right.
Is there a boundary within the surface where there's interior versus surface?
You know, surfaces don't have any thickness at all.
It's just like the touch of, so like if I have the inside of this table, is there a point where there's a boundary between the surface and the interior?
No,
Okay.
no, the surface is a boundary between the object and the rest of reality. And that's the only, there might be other boundaries, like a boundary between this part of the object and another part of the object, right? Like the boundary between Canada and the United States, right? So you can have all kinds of boundaries in there, but there's no specific boundary between a boundary and an object.
Okay.
Because
The interior.
you're just like multiplying boundaries gratuitously there. The outside of the object is the object boundary. And if you have some like boundary of some part of the object, right, which you can have, like the boundary of the bottom half of a sphere, right? But the sphere is made of two hemispheres. So there's a boundary between, say, the bottom hemisphere and the top hemisphere.
Okay.
Just like there is between just like that the whole sphere itself has a boundary, which is its surface. Yeah. Okay. So hope that
Yeah.
makes
That's good.
sense. Yeah. Good. Right. So you have all of these applications. The third application of possibility application of modality was to distinguishing necessary and accidental
Yeah.
properties. So, yeah.
Can we talk about Quine's attack on modality?
Sure.
Because I'm trying to put
Okay.
a paper on it, and I'm in the process of it, and that would really help me out. If you
Yeah.
could give me
So, do you have a specific question about?
Used to know, just survey probably.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, Quine is opposed to what might be called Aristotelian essentialism, which basically says that you can ascribe or single out some properties as necessarily possessed by an object, even though those qualities aren't necessary to every object. So Quine's willing to concede, for the sake of argument, that we could speak of some essential qualities that are universally essential or universally necessary, essentially. So these are universal. These are okay because they just follow from the rules of logic. So an example would be that everything is identical to itself necessarily.
Like asbestos is asbestos, or
Yeah,
what? The
self-identity. Yeah, so like self-identity, everything has this, right? Everything is necessarily self-identical.
Okay.
So it's kind of trivial, not too interesting, right?
Yeah.
Another one would be that everything, if red, is colored. If red, then colored. Everything has that necessarily. So Quine says these, you can talk about these, but these don't matter very much because they're trivial.
Tautology.
Yeah, they're basically tautologies or based on analytic definitional truths. Everyone who's a bachelor is unmarried, things like this. But Aristotle said that things have some essences which are particular only to a certain subclass of real beings. So Aristotle thought that cats are essentially cats.
So the essence of being a cat is catness?
Right. So Morris, Aristotle thought, has catness as his essence. So Morris is necessarily a cat.
And in this situation, Morris is a cat, or Morris has the qualities of catness?
Well, he's just necessarily a cat, which is to say he couldn't be anything that's not a cat and still exist.
Like what if
So Morris couldn't become a dog or a horse or a table or any of these other things, since his essence is to be a cat. So the idea is if you did something to Morris to, so to speak, turn him into a table, you'd have to kill him to do that, and then he wouldn't, like, compress him into a cube and, like, add paste and turn him into a table-shaped furry cat thing, right? That wouldn't be Morris anymore, according to Aristotle. Morris would have been killed very early in this process and ceased to exist necessarily, because his essence is to be a cat. So you can't make him into a non-cat and still have him survive. Another example would be that physical objects are necessarily in space. So what's an example of a physical object? A piece of metal. Okay. So a piece of metal is necessarily located, or necessarily spatial. Let's say spatial. So it's necessarily a spatial entity. The idea is it's not possible for the piece of metal to exist and not have spatial attributes of some sort.
Kind of like with last class, you said that you can't have two items in the same amount of space.
Right.
Unless it's light.
Unless they're bosons. Fermions can't be in the same place at the same time, but bosons can be. So
It's a boson.
it's just a type of fundamental type of particle. But yeah, so all particles are either fermions or bosons, and the Pauli exclusion principle applies to fermions, and it says that you can't have two things in the same energy state at the same time, which rules out their being in the same place at the same time. So like if they're floating or shooting around in space, they're going to be like in different shells of the atoms, and they won't ever coincide. But bosons don't have that rule. So they can sometimes coexist in the same state at like absolute zero and stuff.
Yeah.
Become one or merge
Yeah.
to make a bigger thing. Yeah. So a piece of metal anyway has to be, all these things don't have to be spatial, right? They have to have either location or size or shape or something, right? Any kind of physical. So this gives you what are called Aristotelian essences or necessary properties, because they don't apply to everything. So you get into like a metaphysical question, right? Can we have essences like these? Because Aristotle would regard cathood, catness as an essence, but not being spatial, I don't think. But they would all be necessary properties. I think for Aristotle, being spatial would maybe be part of a thing's essence or something. It's a component. So we can just talk about but Quine's opposed to all necessary properties except those that apply to everything. And his argument is basically that we don't have any way of we don't have any sound criteria of establishing what the essences of things might be. He thinks it's just a matter of what description we use to describe a thing, what essence it's going to turn out to have. So suppose you have a person who's both a bicyclist and a mathematician. He says if we describe him as a mathematician, then he's essentially rational or intellectual. But if we describe him as a bicyclist, he's essentially bipedal, right? So which is his essence? Is he a single man who's both a mathematician and a biped? Is he essentially mathematical or essentially a biped?
Can he not be both?
Well, he might be both, but why would a bicyclist be essentially mathematical? He wouldn't be. And why would a mathematician be essentially a bicyclist? He wouldn't be.
This would not be necessary but accidental.
Yeah. Yeah, but he says they come out as necessary. He would say a mathematician's essentially necessarily mathematical, and a bicyclist necessarily two-legged. Right? That's what he would. That's what he argues. I would call this phony or spurious essentialism. It's not really taking seriously the idea that a thing can have necessary properties in saying that all these truths are linguistic. Necessary properties or essential properties are supposed to be based in a thing and its nature, not in how we describe it. A man doesn't seem to be either necessarily mathematical or necessarily a bicyclist, right? So I would say like neither is the, right? In the case of a human being, he's not necessarily either of those. He could exist without being a bicyclist, right? If he lost his legs, he could still exist. He could not be interested in mathematics, lose his interest in mathematics, or not be mathematically inclined, but still exists. So, what is the essence of a man? Well, Aristotle said it's to be a animal of a certain sort. What kind of animal? What did Aristotle? He said a rational animal. He said that humans are the only rational animals. And that was his theory. That's the essence of man.
The essentialist attitude of psycholinguistic properties, because I saw Carnot was using essentialism in some of his validations of meaning. You know what I'm talking about?
Not exactly.
Carnot.
I don't think Carnap was an essentialist.
He wasn't.
No. No.
Because I saw something he quoted about, which I knew was Aristotle. It was a phrase that said, it was in my paper, a phrase about that if a man doesn't assign meaning to a word, the word therefore has no meaning, which I thought was kind of ridiculous.
Well, I don't know. But Carnap's definitely not an essentialist because he rejects metaphysics altogether. I mean, at that early stage,
Right.
Unless you're talking about Carnap at a much later stage. But he was always quite positivistic and certainly not inclined to talk about essences. Okay, so when you look at modal logic, the most basic form of it is called propositional modal logic. And so the only things you ascribe modalities to are the propositions. But then there's a further development of modal logic called quantified modal logic. Quine was especially opposed to quantified modal logic. When you talk about quantified modal logic, you can introduce claims about properties being necessary to individuals. And Quine doesn't like that. One of the philosophers who came after Quine, named Saul Kripke, was eventually able to prove that quantified modal logic was consistent and could be systematized. And that finally convinced Quine that he had been mistaken. That quantified modal claims are in fact well-formed and should be distinguished from propositional modal claims. So it is necessarily true that a mathematician is mathematical and that a bicyclist is two-legged, and so, right? Those are de dicto claims about propositions. Yeah. The De Ray claims, though, in each case, they are false. Mathematicians are neither necessarily mathematical nor are bicyclists necessarily bipedal, because bicyclists could survive the loss of their legs. They would still exist. Of course, they wouldn't be bicyclists anymore, but that's the de dicto claim that bicyclists necessarily are two-legged. Excuse me, that necessarily bicyclists are two-legged and necessarily mathematicians are mathematical. But the claim that a mathematician is necessarily mathematical isn't true at all. Nor is the claim that a bachelor is necessarily unmarried, since he could get married and not cease to exist. It would not be a death sentence for the bachelor. However much he might protest, right, it wouldn't be a death sentence for him to marry. It's still the proposition that bachelors are unmarried is necessarily true. But the essentialist claim that bachelors have as their essence to be unmarried is false. Does that make sense? So it's tricky. And even Quine got mixed up about it, it seems. So does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's move on to possible worlds then. Now, in trying to systematize talk about modalities, philosophers introduced the notion of a possible world. So the idea is that we have the actual world, which is, so to speak, the totality, the total way in which things are in the world. You could equate it to a complete description of the universe, which no one can ever produce except God. But if you start out here, let this circle represent everything that's encompassed within that description of the total way in which things are in the universe. So that would be the actual world. So in the actual world, things stand in a certain way. Like I'm standing in the actual world, so that's me. But then there are other possibilities, other possible ways things could have been. Like I could be sitting in the chair now instead of standing. It seems like I have it within my power to do that. It's a matter of my choice. I could go over and sit down if I really, really want to, but I won't. So it remains merely a possible world where I'm sitting. So if we call the actual world world 0, then you could have a possible world here, a merely possible world. Call it W1, where instead of my standing there now, I'll be sitting there now. So there'll be a chair and I'll be sitting. So that's an alternative reality. It's a way things could have been, but are not. Just like the world in which we made that pedestal or table out of a few things, but in the actual world that didn't happen. And then in W2, you might have some other thing, like a unicorn exists. So in W2, unicorns are roaming the plains of Nebraska. even though in W1 and W0 they don't have. So you can keep on going on describing worlds like this. The only constraint is there won't be worlds like worlds that have spherical cubes in them and stuff. Because a spherical cube is not possible. So how do we know a spherical cube is not possible? Well, it entails a contradiction. And it's inconceivable that there be a spherical cube. And unimaginable. Okay, so how many possible worlds would you have?
Probably infinite number.
Infinite, right? Yeah. Be an infinite number of those things. Those possible worlds.
So what's philosophically useful about these?
Oh, well, one thing is you can define the modalities in terms of possible worlds. Now, so you can say that a proposition is necessarily true when it's true in every world. So the proposition that all bachelors are unmarried will be true in every possible world. And in that unending infinitude of worlds, all bachelors are unmarried is true in every single one. Okay, so a necessary proposition is true across all worlds. An impossible one will be false across all worlds. A contingent proposition will be true at one world, but false at another world. And a possible proposition will be true in at least one world. Everyone get all that? So you can define them that way. And you could also define an essential property or a necessary property and a contingent property. A necessary property of an individual is a property that that individual has in every possible world where he exists. So being seated or standing is not a necessary property of me because I don't have either of those properties in every world in which I exist. So I exist in W0 and I don't have the property of being seated then, and I exist in W1 and don't have the property of standing then. So both of those, seating and standing, are accidental properties of me when I have them because there are worlds in which I exist in which I don't possess those properties. An essential property or a necessary property of an individual will be a property that it has in every possible world in which it exists. So if a piece of metal is essentially in space, and that says that in every possible world in which that piece of metal exists, or in which a piece of metal exists, it's going to have spatial qualities. There'll be no world in which there's an object that's not in space, like a piece of metal or a rock or whatever. So being in space would be a necessary feature of such an object because the object cannot be found in any possible world without having that property. Whereas I have the property of standing only contingently because there are worlds where you can find me without that property. Any question on that?
Wouldn't the property being extended or having, spectral, isn't that just like a tautology, like Quine was talking about, or is that?
No, because there might be things that don't have that property, like God. Right? God isn't doesn't have any spatial property, or the number 5, or the set with no elements, which is the null set, doesn't have that property. According to Quine, there is a thing called a null set, the empty set, which he equates with 0 in mathematics, in the number arithmetical series 0, 1, 2, 3. He identifies each number with a set. So for Quine, anyway, there are non-spatial entities. Yeah, Quine says that he basically only believes in particles, but because science uses math, he's a reluctant Platonist. He felt compelled to accept the reality of the empty set and many other sets, and he went on to write a book on set theory. Because he felt like we need these abstract objects to make sense of what science tells us about the world, because science relies so much on math.
Can we like step back for a second and how does how would this help refute Quine's counter-arguments against modality?
Right, yeah. Well, so, yeah, given these possible, good question. So, given these possible worlds, though we still have to explain what they are, okay? But given this way of talking about possible worlds, we can draw a very sharp distinction between the conditions under which a ascription of possibility to a proposition is going to be correct, right? Because we have the conditions for saying that necessarily P, possibly P, and so on, are going to be true or false in terms of this model, right? A necessary truth is going to be true in all worlds, a contingent statement true in some and false in some, an impossible statement false in all, right? So they all come out different. But the claims about necessary and contingent properties have a very different reading or interpretation. They get interpreted in terms of whether an object that exists in these worlds will always have a given property when it does. So that brings in objects, whereas the propositional modal logic only talks about the truth values of propositions. So essentially, that's how it gets undermined. Quine's argument gets undermined. So there, to decide what properties the mathematician or the bicyclist has, essentially, we have to look at all the worlds in which he exists and see whether he's a mathematician or a bicyclist in all those worlds. And it turns out he's neither. But that he is a rational animal, say, or a living organism, or whatever true essence we decide he's got.
But how would you feasibly, if the number of worlds is infinite, possible, how could you feasibly find all of them where he has
Well,
there's too many?
yeah, that's an epistemological question. That is, how do we know what's necessarily true, and how do we know what's impossible, and so on, right? How do we know what the essences of things are? In the end, you have to rely on some kind of ability we have to discern necessary truth. Right. A number of these claims were traditionally said to be knowable a priori, like that bachelors are unmarried and cubes aren't round and things like that. We just know them by grasping the concepts. That seems not so problematic.
Yeah.
When it comes to the essences, it's more difficult. What Quine conceded to Kripke was not anything about how we might know these claims are true, but just that the claims make logical sense, and that we can distinguish logically in our notation and in our interpretation when something has a property accidentally and when it contingently and when it has it essentially, but not how we would come to know that in a particular case. The debate was just over, right? Are these concepts of necessary and contingent properties well-formed? Are statements ascribing them well-formed and understood within our interpretation of modal logic? So I think one would have to hold that we have some kind of intuitive grasp of what a thing is, of its nature, and from that we justify conclusions about what's essential to its existence and what is not. I mean, just take a simple case. Take the case of the piece of metal. Why do we think that the piece of metal can't be, isn't possibly a, say, some kind of a non-spatial thing like the empty set? Well, we just find it utterly inconceivable, right? That something like that could, like a piece of metal, could be identified with the empty set. I guess the argument is there's no feasible way of supporting such an identification. When we think about it intuitively, we don't see any way that the empty set could somehow be transformed into a piece of metal. The justification of that claim would have to be based on some kind of a priori intuition. So that would be the best answer that's available. Yet such claims seem as plausible as other claims, like that you can't have a spherical cube. They seem of comparable plausibility. I mean, maybe the impossibility of the spherical cube is more rock solid obvious than that the null set couldn't turn into a statue. But I don't think that all a priori claims have to have the same level of obviousness, though. I mean, some might be more obvious than others, but they still might be really highly justified. I mean, I guess I'd say I feel as confident that the null set couldn't turn into a statue as I do in saying that there's a desk here now. Right. So I think claims like the null set couldn't turn into a statue have, I suppose, a significant amount of intrinsic credibility, even if they're not as certain as saying that you can't have a round square, where you can actually see what the contradiction is. So I hope that helps with that. Right. I don't think we should make too much of the claim that because the falsehood of self-contradictions is utterly obvious, that therefore anything that's not utterly obvious can't be impossible. Seems impossible to turn a statue into the empty set. I mean, how would God do that? It would seem like you had the empty set already before you had the statue. Right? Seems like there's some very good arguments for saying that things have some of these qualities by their very essence, that they couldn't lack them and still exist.
So what role do principles play in these modes? Do they define them or exclude them?
Which modes do you mean? The modals?
Yeah.
And what kind of principles?
Well, like
logical or
universal
epistemic?
laws, things like that.
Well, there are universal laws. Laws of modal logic.
But
There are principles of modal logic.
Right, but your comment was that they're not necessarily impossible, but if you apply certain principles, don't they become necessarily impossible?
Well, some of them are necessarily impossible. I'm just saying it may not be as obvious No, they're still very, very obvious. You see, here's the difference. When you say that you can't have a spherical cube, you can rely on this law of contradiction, non-contradiction. Yeah, but when you say that the null set can't become a statue or something, your intuition doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with how you think of matter and the null set and stuff like that.
Definition
They don't, yeah, they don't seem to,
compatible.
no, they seem like they belong to different realms altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Now, of course, one can posit some other necessary principles such that it'll become a contradiction. Then you can dispute those principles. But at any rate, it becomes an inference, and so it's going to be a little less obvious than something that we directly grasp, like that you can't have a spherical thing that's not a sphere. Yeah. So, yeah. So they may. So those truths may be a little more derivative, but they still seem quite sound. All right. So the thing became. Exactly what are these possible worlds and how are they to be defined or understood themselves? So you got 4 different theories of possible worlds that came forward, or 4 different types of theories anyway. So one of these is the conceptualist theory. The second is the combinatorial theory. So these are theories of possible worlds. Combinatorial theory. The abstract world theory. And the concrete world theory. And there can be variations on these theories, but these are the variations within each category. They're basically different versions of the same sort of approach. Okay, so the conceptualist theory, it says that possible worlds are conceptual entities. They're like imagined or conceived scenarios or narratives. So the world with unicorns, I was thinking about. So you have a bunch of ideas which include imagined unicorns and dragons and other kinds of things. You can imagine yourself sitting when you're standing or standing when you're sitting, right? So in all these cases, what we're doing is imagining different scenarios or narratives that could describe a universe. So in this theory, though, implies that possibility depends on the mind. So will that work? Does possibility depend on minds? That would be our question.
Doesn't sound like it. Because if possibility is what actually is or isn't. Does that seem like
It includes what it is.
Oh, so what is the imagination or the concept?
Well, I'm just saying what's possible includes everything that is plus all things that could be.
Oh.
Okay, so does that depend on the mind is the question. On a mind or on some mind? Or could you have a reality without minds?
Yeah, one's not the one to get the other, right? Can there be a reality without cognition?
Well, yeah, that's part of the question here.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's the question of the measure of the man type thing.
Well, yeah. Idealists say that there can't be anything without mind, but realists say that all kinds of things can exist apart from the mind, like the physical world. That before life evolved, there was a rich world of material things.
Before mind work.
Yeah, before minds were, there was there was matter,
Right.
and that mind evolved out of
Volcanoes.
yeah, volcanoes, planets, the Big Bang, cosmic inflation, formation of galaxies, creation of metals. Then a couple of billion years ago, you started to get a primitive life form, so on. So you didn't get mind until somewhere after that.
But it does take the mind to establish that there was something before the mind.
Well, that has to do with knowledge, though, not
Yeah.
possibility. Yeah. So it looks like the conceptualist theory requires a mind for there to be reality. And if we say that humans haven't always existed, then what are we going to have to assume here to make this work? There has to be some mind that's always cognizant.
God.
Yeah.
So you can make that work.
Yeah, so it seems like this can't work without God.
Right.
Yeah, so this implies God. Otherwise, there's too many problems. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be God, but it has to be like an omniscient being. May not be perfectly good, but yeah, some kind of God, right? Kind of all-knowing entity, cosmic entity. Yeah.
So that would bring like theological problems about the existence of
Yeah,
God.
that would bring that into logic. Yeah, so like, yeah. That may not be so great. I don't think we need to have our logic be dependent on theology. Just as a matter, from the logician's point of view, making modal logic depend on God is not great. But beyond that, what about the possible existence of this God? It seems like his possibility, the possibility of God herself, right, would depend on, according to this theory, God's having like ideas and stuff about himself or herself, I should say. Right? So does that make sense? Do ideas exist? Does God exist because of his ideas, or do his ideas exist because God exists? I mean, it seems like this says, right, that God wouldn't even be possible to begin with unless God had ideas about God. Whereas it seems more plausible to say that God can have ideas about God because God exists. And hence that the ideas depend on the possibility and the reality of God, not that the substance of God somehow depends on God's having these ideas. So
It would have to be.
it seems like there's a backwardness to this in the order of explanation.
But it would depend on a certain attribute for that God to be what they're claiming.
Yeah, that
You'd
too.
have to be an individual.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's a lot of problems with conceptualism. Right? All right. Combinatorial theory says that you start out with what's real, and you analyze it down to like fundamental building blocks, which would be like microparticles, stuff, electrons, quarks, right? Okay? So you analyze everything down to the actual basic particles. And those exist actually, or real, they exist, particles, but they're real. The actual world's composed of the arrangement of all these basic particles. Okay. Other possible worlds are composed of these same basic particles, though arranged in other ways. So if you arrange them unicorn-wise,
Yeah.
then you'll have, in that other, you'd have unicorns. So that's what it means to say that there's a possible world with unicorns. It means to say that there's a possible arrangement of microparticles unicorn-wise. Okay, so all these alternative worlds are alternative arrangements of microparticles. So that's the combinatorial theory. So remember the table that we made out of the
Yeah.
pedestal, and it was a merely possible table, whatever. Well, that would be explained by this, right? Because that's a possible arrangement which is not actual. It's a possible way that the particles could be arranged. That's not an actual way. So it exists in a possible world. So that's the combinatorial theory. Any thoughts on that one? How about this? What if there, in some other possible world, were more basic particles than there are actually? Yeah, suppose in this world we have a Google of basic particles. But why couldn't it be a possible world where you have like two Google, right? Or Google to the Google basic particles? Then they wouldn't be arrangements of these, because you only have those ones. Other worlds, it's got more. Maybe it doesn't even have those. Maybe it's got like different ones, but twice as many. Or the same number, but different ones. Or a much larger number. So it doesn't seem like you can understand all the possibilities as arrangements of the basic particles.
So you said that there could be more basic particles?
Yeah.
Or different arrangements or both?
More of them and different ones. Not different arrangements, just
Different particles?
different particles, like not the one we have here, but like
Atoms.
yeah, like some other one. No, just like some other ones. Like they say every day, like every second, all kinds of particles just appear out of the firmament of the quantum field, only to like vanish. So there seem to be a lot of possibilities of particles out there.
Popping into existence.
Yeah, so maybe some pop into existence there that didn't pop into existence here. Who's to say? Yeah.
So why is that a problem? You just add more worlds to the already infinite number where there's,
Yeah, no, but on this theory, it's a problem because they claim that all the worlds are constructed out of the particles that actually exist. You can't have any, like, you can't have different particles.
Wouldn't have
Because they're rooting it all in the what's possible is being understood as a rearrangement of what's actual. That's why. They don't want to suppose you could have these other objects because that's too metaphysical. They want a theory of possibility that roots it in what's scientifically observable.
we want to talk about like atoms or stuff that we already know that exists.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so suppose you could have also different kinds of fundamental particles with different laws of nature in some other world. They wouldn't be the same particles as we have here, and so you couldn't construct them out of them.
So you said what is possible is a rearrangement of what is actual?
Yes. Yeah, so you could easily understand that there could be unicorns because the particles we have could be,
Constructed into a uniform?
yeah, it would
At
just
the
be a
beginning,
different
yeah.
path of evolution or something, right?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. But it doesn't seem like that captures all the possibilities.
Why not?
Because you could have different worlds with different laws of nature and different particles.
Oh, so this restricts itself to the same laws of nature?
Seems to, yeah, because if you change the laws of nature too much, it's hard to see how they'd be the same particles anymore. In any way, why couldn't they just be different particles? I mean, just like you're a different person than me, and I'm a different person than him. This electron's different than that one, right?
Like DNA?
They're just different.
Okay.
Simple difference.
Well,
Why couldn't you have more simply, just more basic particles? If there were more of them, since they're basic, they'd have to be different ones. And they can't be made out of other ones. So if you add some more particles, then they're not constructions out of the particles that actually exist.
Okay.
They're just additional add-ons.
So you're limited by experience.
You're limited by
Particles?
the particles that you have.
which is experience in terms of epistemic reality.
I guess you
They
could
won't
put it
let you
that.
go too,
They won't let you go too far.
yeah.
Wait, what do you mean epistemic reality?
In other words, we say there's an atom, they're not gonna give you room for a microatom because it's a different particle. It'll still have to be some form of atom, whereas a microatom might be made in jello.
Or whatever.
Right.
Some different substance.
Yeah, so they're gonna restrict you to their epistemic format, which is, these things exist, we can have more of them, we can have less of them, but we can't have pink elephants involved. In other words, there's no mix and match.
There's a limitation. They're saying it seems to restrict possibility.
Yeah.
Another example could be that in some world there are unembodied minds, like Descartes conceived.
Unembodied mind.
Unembodied, yeah.
Nobody.
No bodies, just
Just the
like
minds.
centers of consciousness that
Floating
exist.
one.
Yeah, well, they don't float, they're not in space, they're just
Because
like,
they don't have a physical being.
they don't have physical bodies.
Disembodied?
Yeah, they're
Disembodied
disembodied if you like, but they never had a body, so they're not exactly disembodied.
You have to disembody.
But we could use disembodied to mean unembodied, that's fine. I mean, I think that's how it is often used.
But that's one I'm used to, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Semantics.
Yeah, that's pure semantics. Am I losing anybody here, or you want to refute what I'm saying?
An abstract world theory?
So we okay with the combinatorial theory?
Yeah.
I mean, we understand what it is.
Yeah, so what if you just said that, the theory, what is possible is a rearrangement of what is actual, so you have to have the atoms that we already know about. So what if you just make reference to some fundamental particle without specifying that it's an atom or,
Neutrino or whatever.
yeah, well, why not just say, just make reference to some general category?
Well, the category won't do, because remember we have individuals existing in worlds. That's how we determine their accidental and essential properties. It's not just the category of it, it's the individual that goes into the world. Of course, you could dispute that. You could say, well, other worlds don't really contain individuals, they just contain like categories of them, and we can't distinguish among them, so yeah. But anyway, so the combinatorial theory has, some possible responses. But they have some prima facie problems, right? That's, they could say we're deceiving ourselves when we think that these other worlds can actually contain particular individuals which are basic and don't exist here. It's just really the kind, right, that exists in those worlds, not the individuals. It's like, remember we made the possible table out of the two things here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that fits the combinatorial theory just fine, right? But we can't make a possible thing that way which doesn't have any parts which exist here. So we really can't specify these other worlds, these really distant worlds, possible worlds, right?
So
We can't specify them with any exactitude just because they don't contain the same matter as our world does. So the argument for saying those worlds are determinative as opposed to like indeterminate, you might say, well, these worlds are kind of fuzzy and indeterminate. We can just say that they contain kinds of particles unlike any here, but we can't identify the particles. Yeah, so that's like what you're saying. And yeah, I think there's some merit to that. That would be a way that the combinatorialist could try to defend his view. Okay, now the abstract worlds theory says that possible worlds are abstractions, that they're abstract entities. They don't depend on the mind for their reality. They're made up out of abstract propositions or abstract properties. In the typical version, classical version, you have a set of propositions such that every proposition appears either negated or unnegated in the set, and that defines a possible world. So a possible world will contain every proposition either unnegated or negated. So like the proposition that you're sitting there could be in the world, and the proposition that I'm standing is in the world, right? because you're sitting and I'm standing. But the proposition that there's a purple unicorn over there in the corner appears negated. There's not a purple unicorn.
Can you repeat what you said again? Possible worlds are abstractions of what?
Possible worlds are abstract entities consisting of a set of propositions. So they're complete sets of propositions where every proposition appears negated or unnegated somewhere in that set or conjunction. So a possible world is like a long, very long proposition made up out of abstract statements, like I am standing here, she is sitting there, you're sitting there, there's a chair over there. There's not a purple unicorn over there. There's not a lizard over there, and so on. Every proposition appears in the set. But if you change where the negations go, you get different possible worlds. Right?
They appear negated or unnegated?
Yeah, every proposition in the universe is in there.
So why is that word appears there? Why is it just negated or unnegated? Why
Yeah,
is it-
that's all I meant, is you can, to have a possible world, you have to have every proposition be included in some set. And the proposition has to occur as an affirmation or as a negation. So you have to say either that it's true that there's a cat on the table or it's false that there's a cat on the table. Then you go to the next table. We've got to say that
there is or isn't a cat on the table?
yeah, and there isn't an elephant's trunk on the table, and there isn't this or that or whatever. And so every part of the universe is going to be specified eventually through an infinitude of propositions. And if you change the truth values, the negation signs on any of them, right, then you're going to get a different possible world. And there'll be an infinite number of these worlds, right?
And aren't the first two theories, aren't the possible worlds and then abstractions themselves to begin with?
Yeah, but these abstractions here don't depend on the mind. They're just abstract entities, like numbers.
Okay.
So no one ever had to think of them or anything. They either obtain or don't.
Is that for the...
They're either facts or they're falsehoods. So what you do is you get every fact and every falsehood and you list them all together, and that's a world. Then you can make alternative worlds, right, where some of the propositions you list in there are actually falsehoods, even though you list them as facts. Those are alternative possible worlds.
So it's like an infinitely long
Yes.
string of propositions.
Yes, it's an infinitely long, yeah, it's going to be infinite. For each world is going to have an infinite description, and that description will either be instantiated, in which case it's the actual world, or it'll fail at some point, in which case it's another possible
Binary,
world.
like it's either 0 or 1
Yeah.
for all the propositions.
Yeah. It's either going to be that the world obtains or that it doesn't obtain. And there's only one world that obtains, which is the one that is happening.
Can you explain the obtain versus unobtained?
Yeah. A proposition obtains when it corresponds to what exists. Corresponds to reality. So it's like truth. So this proposition, this long proposition, we're imagining is a true one.
So this long proposition being the possible world?
Yeah. Yeah. And we've got to stop now because we've reached our terminal moment. So we'll get to the concrete world theory next time. Suffice to say that according to the concrete world theory, possible worlds are other places that you can't visit, but which are entire worlds. So they're like bubble universes. So according to this, is a place where there are unicorns and stuff, which you can't travel to. But that's why unicorns are possible, because they actually exist in this other parallel world. So that's the concrete worldview, developed by David Lewis. So he doesn't believe in abstract entities. He's more nominalistic. He doesn't want to have propositions and things. So according to him, each of us exists in just one world. We don't exist in other possible worlds at all. But other people who resemble us do. They're called our counterparts. So, yeah. So in some other world, there's a person exactly like you, except they have like a different color hair. Or they're better at math than you, or whatever. All right, so I'm going to stop for now, and we'll resume with a discussion of a comparison, well, more details on the concrete world theory, of course, and then we'll compare it with the abstract world theory.